Hi, Heather.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Good to be here this morning and yesterday.
Yeah, looking forward to the presentation. I'll just turn
Yeah.
it over to you now.
Okay, great. Yeah. Welcome back, everyone, for our second session today. I'm really excited to be joining you as a presenter and just being part of this entire student rights conference yesterday and today. I'm Heather Eckner, and I serve as the Director of Statewide Education for the Autism Alliance of Michigan. I am a white woman. I use she, her pronouns. I have brown hair, a black top on, and a light tan jacket today. Um, and the Autism Alliance of Michigan is a statewide nonprofit. Our education initiatives efforts are dedicated to leading efforts to raise expectations and expand opportunities for students with disabilities. And that is statewide, systems wide, and disability wide. So that's a disclaimer I give a lot where we do this work under the banner of an autism led organization, but all of our education focused work is disability wide. And the Autism Alliance of Michigan education initiatives advance system level efforts that address root causes of barriers to access, opportunity, and educational outcomes, while we also work to support greater acceptance in preparing students for safe, successful, and inclusive lives. And as Mark gave a little bit of a description yesterday in the first day with MyPAC, the Michigan Parent Advocate and Attorney Coalition, that Autism Alliance of Michigan serves as the backbone organization to MyPAC, which is a statewide grassroots network with a broad shared advocacy agenda focused around three large areas of access, increasing access to equitable opportunities, improving educational benefit for students with disabilities, and driving systemic change, which that third part, driving systemic change, is what I'm focusing on with today's session. So next slide, please. So most of you here today have helped a student obtain an evaluation, advocated for appropriate services or a certain placement, or maybe compensatory education, either as a parent of your own child or on behalf of a client. I also think that most of us here are aware that the majority of the challenges in the education system that you've encountered are encountered individually are repeatedly encountered by other families over and over and over again. So I don't think that's something that's lost on this group. So like many of you, I came to this work through individual advocacy as an educator first, then a parent, and now as a policy advocate. And I've spent years helping students and their families navigate barriers, one at a time. And what I've learned is that individual advocacy changes lives. It absolutely does. And eventually I began asking a different question. And it was, why are so many families fighting the same battles? And I would describe my individual advocacy work as this might date me, but solidly Gen X, the movie Groundhog Day, right? Like, why am I living the same scenario over and over again? Sometimes even with the same IEP team in the same school building, but for a different student. Why are we having to kind of fight the same battles that I was just here last week fighting, right? So at the point that we stop asking, how do we get what's necessary in this one instance for this one child, which we must do, we also start asking, why does the system keep producing this problem? And that's when we're entering the realm of systems change advocacy. Individual advocacy protects and upholds rights. Collective advocacy changes the system that determines whether those rights are realized consistently. And here's what I'm hoping to cover in today's session through the lens of Autism Alliance of Michigan's education initiatives, mostly framed as a case study for demonstrating a replicable model for building the civic infrastructure for implementation and accountability that enables collective advocacy and lasting systems change. So we'll talk about some of these complementary roles. I'll show you some examples. What's really important about community voice being organized into the evidence that drives policy change, sharing some of those practical strategies for building coalitions to sustain that collective action. This is all based around a real world statewide case study And we just want to be talking about how we can strengthen all of our collective advocacy efforts across communities today. So next slide. So as I mentioned, individual advocacy, absolutely necessary. It's what, it protects and upholds student rights. And it's actually where systems change begins, not where it ends though, right? So at that individual level, then we look to that collective advocacy where what we're aiming to change the system, and it determines whether those rights are realized, like I said before, consistently, right? For many, many students, not just this one student, this one time that we don't ever talk about again, right? Because we had to agree to like not talk about it. So, if you've found yourself in this space, however much time you've been spending in it, and you're saying, I've seen this exact issue before, that's the sign that you're looking at a systems issue, not just an isolated incident. Next slide. So I'd like to pause on this quote for a moment because I think it does fundamentally change how we can think about advocacy. So at first, when I first encountered this quote years ago, the statement feels and sounds a bit discouraging. It kind of feels hopeless, right? It's like, man, we're like gerbils on the wheel in a system that is like not set up and designed for our kids that we serve, or our own children. Like, what are we supposed to do? But over time, I've actually found it, I've rechanneled it in a way to find it empowering. I don't take this quote to mean that anyone intended these outcomes, even if they might have, only because truly for my own sustainability, now like on the family advocacy side, going more than 15 years, the only way I can avoid total utter burnout is like, it's not a useful focus of my energy to go after the individuals and try to figure out the individual's intent and actions, because that'll burn you out really quick. So I look at this to mean that the structures, the incentives, the assumptions that are built into our systems is what produces the outcomes we're seeing today. And that is by design, because we are the ones, people can design the systems, right? And there's a lot of entrenched like aspects of the system that people have designed, sometimes with ill intent, yes, but we are the ones that are able to change it. And if we want different outcomes, we must be willing to change those underlying conditions and not just respond to the symptoms, because the symptoms then will never go away. And so when we see persistent challenges in special education, disproportionate discipline, inconsistent access to services, staffing shortages, inequitable funding, low graduation rates for students with disabilities, it's tempting to think of these things as isolated failures, or the result of one individual's decisions, but really it isn't. If you analyze the system from this kind of higher level view, you see that these things have strategic leverage points, which we'll talk about. So systems thinking really challenges us to ask a different question. What if these outcomes aren't random, as this quote implies? What if they're the predictable result of how the system is currently designed? And if that's true, then solving one student's problem, while incredibly important and necessary, doesn't change the conditions necessarily that caused the problem in the first place. And so most of us in this Zoom room spend our time responding to what systems thinkers would call events. That's an IEP dispute, a denial of service, a suspension, a complaint, or a due process hearing. And those responses matter because students obviously need support and remedy immediately. And if we stop there, we'll continue responding to those same kinds of problems tomorrow and the next day and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And oh, guess what? We just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the IDEA. And if I talk to advocates who were there from the beginning and are there and are here today, they're saying we're still seeing the same entrenched issues, right? So that is the system. Next slide. So I mentioned systems change is all about changing the conditions. So there's some helpful frameworks out there. There's a whole body of work and research that aligns to and supports what I'm framing today for you all as the case study for systems change with people power. And so these are some of the frameworks within that body of work. So this framework here reminds us that systems operate on multiple levels, and beneath the very visible events are entrenched patterns of behavior, practices, norms. And beneath those patterns are structures. So things like funding formulas, accountability systems, policies, information flows, relationships, and incentives. And even deeper still are the goals and beliefs, that mindset that shape how the entire system functions. And so the deeper we go in this inverted pyramid, the harder the work is to shift what's in place, and the greater our opportunity is to create lasting change, right? Like for a quick example, just to make it very simple, if there's a 25-year long special education teacher who just fundamentally, mindset wise, does not believe a kid with a disability should be in a general regular education classroom, and something along the way shifts that mindset, like think about what they've put in place and in practice over time, and if that mindset would have been shifted, how different things could have been. So that's partly what makes that the hardest and the most entrenched, and why it's kind of visualized as this inverted pyramid. But that gives you a sense of like working at all these different levels. And so when we think about student rights, we often focus again on what's happening to obviously the individual student at that moment in time, those events of the system, right? But systems thinking asks us a different question. It asks us to consider what policies, practices, relationships, and power structures keep producing these same barriers for thousands of students. And so many organizations that are out there do excel, particularly in one area, often of systems issues. So maybe that's legal advocacy, maybe it's parent support and information, maybe policy issues, and there's specific policy issues. It's in part because it's hard to find support, like resources to fund it, and it's hard, long-term sustained work. There are few organizations out there that intentionally build the infrastructure for connecting all of these different conditions towards change. And so what I'm interweaving with the session today, in addition to kind of showing you these sort of like thinking frameworks around systems change, is I want to introduce the idea or the concept of building infrastructure for systems change. Next slide. And so today's session, again, it isn't just about advocacy as a broader topic, but it's about where we choose to focus our advocacy. And I use the term leverage points frequently. Like if you know me, and I know I see a lot of MyPAC members on here today, so shout out to MyPAC members. You'll probably have heard me say, strategic leverage points in the system, right? Kind of jargony, but leverage points really are the areas where meaningful change can come from intentionally intervening in those structures, relationships, information flows, power centers, and towards the goals that will shape the system behavior. So you analyze like all those different conditions and all those different angles, and you're looking for like those strategic leverage points. And so again, we're constantly asking, if we want to change a system because we see all of these challenges, all of these symptoms, where should we focus our efforts? There's so many places, there's so many issues. And so, some of those examples in special education, is it around individual IEP dispute resolution? Is it the state complaint process? Is it a funding formula for resource flow? Is it data access and transparency, data collection? So like that implementation accountability angle. Is it family engagement? Broader accountability systems for outcomes for students? Is it fundamental beliefs about disability? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So again, it's a lot of different areas. And so how do you build an infrastructure that can kind of house all of these different areas, but still moving towards targeted goals and focused alignment to really affect change across a statewide system? And one of the most influential system thinkers in this kind of sector and space is Donella Meadows, if you're familiar. But Donella Meadows taught that not every intervention has the same potential to change a system. So we often spend tremendous energy responding to events that systems create, right? And again, it forces us to. This is by design. The exhaustion, the way it wears us down, the lack of, like Liz said in her earlier session, the fact that, envelopes are lost and things aren't accessible. Like this is all part of the wearing it down. And we're spending so much time responding to events. We're helping one student, we're resolving that one dispute, we're filing that one complaint. And again, all of those actions are necessary. All of those actions matter. And if we want lasting change so that we're not repeating these patterns over and over again, we have to ask what's producing this problem repeatedly? Why is it happening over and over again? And Donella Meadows would describe these leverage points. These are the leverage points, right? Like where the strategic change can produce significant impact throughout an entire system. And so again, connecting that directly to student rights within special education, intervening at many different levels, there can still be systems change, advocacy efforts, even when you're working with individual families navigating IEPs, right? Or like I said, improving the state complaint procedures and process and demanding better investigations and actually monitoring corrective action, changing funding policies, strengthening accountability. So we can shift the way our education system fundamentally approaches support of students with disabilities and inclusive practices. And so this visual is just kind of showing you again in the way that the inverted pyramid was, kind of most obvious and to hardest to change. This is kind of showing leverage points with on efficacy, right? Like how effective and how deep do they go? So if you hear about paradigm shifts, right? That's one of the deepest, but it's one of the hardest. Structural elements is where we oftentimes get stuck because of the minutia of everything. And so the higher the leverage point, the greater the potential for lasting systems change. But what the little people show you down below is that it often requires more collaboration. So there's like these formulas almost that take shape about the strategy of analyzing a system, viewing it through root cause analysis and trying to identify strategic leverage points, but also bringing in the collaboration, the collective efforts that require it to make it a successful impact, right? Next slide. So everything I'm sharing today fits somewhere on this pathway effectively, kind of broken down for simplicity. When we designed Autism Alliance of Michigan's education initiatives, we intentionally asked ourselves, what are the highest leverage opportunities for improving educational opportunities and outcomes for students with disabilities? And the answer was not a single program or policy. And in part because there are a lot of great programs out there, and in part because there are a lot of great advocates and organizations working on specific policy lanes. What was missing in the system as we analyzed it in Michigan was what was needed it was required to build the infrastructure to move from collective community voice to collective systems change advocacy. And so Autism Alliance of Michigan is an example of applying truly that Donna Meadows framework in practice. So individual advocacy helps students navigate the system. Collective advocacy helps redesign the system so fewer students have to navigate the same barriers in the future. That's kind of the gist of it, right? So some key points from sort of grounding us together is that systems have those strategic leverage points. Collective advocacy, collective impact targets those leverage points. And I'm providing one example through the lens of Autism Alliance of Michigan today on how to organize around them. And I want those of us today in this session to think about how you can join in with similar efforts and maybe even build your own in your own communities or state. So next slide. There we go. So the case study that I'm sharing today, again, isn't just the story of one organization's work. It's really an example of intentionally building infrastructure that's targeted around influencing the conditions that shape educational opportunities and outcomes for thousands of students, not just one. And that brings us to a framework that's guided our work over several years. And so I just kind of have this like breakdown comparison here. And I think we have our first Zoom poll, which I did not put on slides. Oh, thank you. So prepared. I love it. So I'm just curious, um, in your work, thinking about the past year, your efforts, right? Wherever you are, whether you're an advocate, a parent, an attorney, someone, a professional provider, where have you spent most of your advocacy time? So pick the single choice most if you had to boil it down. Kind of curious what our results will be for in the room. We'll give it another minute. Are we able to? Oh, yeah, perfect. Okay. So I'm not at all surprised by these results. And actually, I'd love to have a screenshot of this for our grant funders. So if somebody wants to grab a screenshot of this for me or like give me the results, I would love this. In part because that's the pitch we've been making as a 501c3 grant funded organization is that there's a lot of activity in these realms of individual advocacy, individual cases, and again, what our theory of change is and what our premise is that we also need that infrastructure for collective advocacy where we bring all of these experiences together and do that next step layer of analyzing and finding the leverage points and aligning around shared goals so that we can take collective action together to change and break apart those entrenched barriers. So I'd love to just show those results to my funders. But most of us, this is again, I wasn't surprised at all by the results because most of us begin with individual advocacy. That's how we find ourselves in this path. That's how we find ourselves in these shared spaces. And so the question again is, um, you know, who's doing the work of, and then those that are doing that work, like AAOM, how do we intentionally collect and connect all of these individual experiences so that they can become people power, collective people power, and that's the underlying kind of aim of it all. So next slide. So my pack as a co-host alongside Abner Weicker Law and as a statewide grassroots network in Michigan, you might be thinking like, why create another coalition? Because there's a lot of coalitions in the education policy space. And the brief history is back in 2020, the Autism Alliance of Michigan was really convening broad, what I would call grass tops, so leadership level stakeholders in the system to try to address ongoing issues. And then COVID, pandemic school closures hit, and it kind of morphed into like a rapid response of so many students and their families were disconnected, obviously, from many support services, from not just schools, but community providers and everything. So at the time, we were convening a regular table that we called the Special Education Coalition of Michigan. And it was mostly made up of leaders from organizations, so CEOs, executive directors, department heads from MDHHS and Michigan Department of Ed, legislators, both congressional lawmakers and state House representatives and senators, policy advisors from the governor's office, education associations, and education labor. And because of that, we started getting invited into some policy spaces. And in almost every space that I would be then invited to and entered, we were brought in as an afterthought after many decisions had already been made. And there was kind of this expectation that I would just show up, we'd check the box of disability and I would go along to get along. And I made a lot of people very unhappy that that's the polar opposite of how I operate. And I would look around these rooms, and this is the thing. There are inner sanctum rooms, not to sound too dramatic, where ultimately massive statewide, system-wide policy decisions are made. And I'd look around those rooms and I'd think, oh, there's literally almost like every seat at the table is for a system entrenched representative, and like where's the voice of lived experience? Where's the voice of just that, the people most impacted by the system that the system is supposed to be serving? And I thought to myself, how then can we build something that would at least garner that spot at the table, right? Because what's the famous saying? If you're not if you're not at the table, you're on the menu kind of thing. And so it is in large part because isolated stories can easily be swept away and or sort of passed along as like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I've never, you might hear an administrator say that in an IEP meeting. We've never had this issue before. And we know when we all talk with each other, you absolutely have had this issue before, but you play it off like it's novel every time. And therefore it doesn't change for all the other students to come, right? And so I realized in Michigan, there was not one collective coalition in the state that was unapologetically, I cannot overemphasize that word, unapologetically focused on the experiences and priorities of students with disabilities and their families. And so that's what my PAC set out to become and to be and to grow. And in part, it's that theory of change that organized stories, organized experiences do become power, civic power as part of civic infrastructure. And so it was October of 2020 that the Autism Alliance of Michigan first formed our Michigan Parent Advocate and Attorney Coalition. It was like some of the people on here might have been part of that first set of like 25 people I reached out to and said, hey, let's meet. So thank you for showing up for that meeting. And now more than 5 years later, we've reached 500 members over 5 years and going. And it ebbs and flows, right, with like how engaged people can be and need to be and want to be, and in what areas and in what ways. And so it almost takes on this whole life and infrastructure of its own. But that in and of itself is a tremendous proof point for the need of something like this in a system, right? Whenever we're calling for change. And it really was created around this fundamental belief that families already possess the expertise and that lived experience provides. So we needed to give that an amplified voice, demonstrate the credibility of that voice. And so I'm going to show you some examples of how we did that through like more formalized projects. But all of this is centered around this idea kind of in the theory of change. So next slide. So we formed my PAC, and once you've organized people, you start to look at like how do we make decision makers, policy leaders listen to what we're calling for, the needs that we're trying to uplift. And so the Autism Alliance of Michigan set out to conduct an in-depth survey connected to special education experiences statewide in Michigan. And our purpose of the statewide special education experience survey was to determine the current state of like special education from the perspectives of both students that have gone through it, so individuals with disabilities and their families, because parents, as we well know, exercise rights on behalf of their students for most of their school career, right? So that, again, that lived experience. And our aim was to share these findings with our core constituents in an effort towards building a shared systems change agenda, right? So it was first and foremost to come back to our coalition members and say, this is the collective results of your experiences. And do we all agree and align on our findings of these results? Does this resonate? Can you get behind this? But then what we also utilized the statewide survey for was to promote that shared agenda in policy decision-making spaces. And it's really broadly based around increased opportunities and improved outcomes for students with disabilities in Michigan. So there's plenty of reports out there. So we kind of live this mantra all the time. Anytime we do a body of work that results in a report, we say, this can't simply be just another report that like sits on a shelf somewhere. It has to be some kind of mechanism through which there's a leverage point that we then utilize it towards for change, right? So that lived experience becoming policy evidence is the C survey example. And, I kind of pulled like the buckets from our theory of change to show how it's like collective community voice, evidence, and then like how do we lend that towards policy change? Decision makers, like legislators, because voting constituents, they do care what their voting constituents have to say and bring forward to them to a certain extent, absolutely. And sometimes individuals approaching lawmakers, something will really resonate and you can drive policy change and something systems wide from that one, kind of limited or individual story or experience. But on the whole, these critical decision makers in the governor's office and department heads and broadly within the legislature rarely change policy because of one heartbreaking story. Rarely it ultimately changes because of that. It more often changes because hundreds of stories reveal systemic patterns. And so again, that's what this statewide survey was supposed to sort of like kickstart that broad-based effort towards. But evidence alone also does not change policy. So next slide. So an example of that was where the top priority that came out of the special education experience survey, as well as there was another landscape education stakeholder analysis that we conducted, pointed to the need that like everybody agreed on across the state to address special education funding and resources as a root cause for systemic repeated systems barriers, right? And we knew that we would need to not only demonstrate a research and evidence-based path forward to transform the funding structure for special education in Michigan, but we also knew that we needed to create consensus. We needed to build, again, so there's collective voice of our lived experience and our core constituents, right? But then there's the other stakeholders in the system that have a lot more lobbying power and proximity and influence to decision makers. And so how could we approach this in a way that we could demonstrate consensus building to make a more credible call for transformative change? And the most viable way to make this happen, I tried to get like just grant funding to support it. And it was a hard case that, I mean, truthfully, it's hard to find grant support for things focused solely on disability. And so that's a growing level of education and awareness that we've been trying to build within the philanthropic sector. But it was hard to find a partner to buy in on this. And it was too much for us to just convene alone. And I woke up one day and had this epiphany that I was like, you know who should want this and I shouldn't have to be begging for it? Like the legislature should want this. Like they should want to be well-informed for decision-making purposes for how they appropriate state dollars and how many state dollars need to be appropriated. And so we pivoted strategy and mounted a whole effort to convince the legislature of why they needed this study to happen. And so Autism Alliance of Michigan was successful in advocating for legislative appropriation to support the project in Michigan's fiscal year 24 budget cycle. And so this final report was the product of a legislative project that resulted in a whole framework of how Michigan needs to transform how we fund special education in the state. So we ran that project from fall of 2024 till fall of 2025. So this report was released. It was provided to the legislature per boilerplate statute in October of 2025. And so this was developed as a request now of the legislature, which kind of lit a fire under stakeholders to come to the table, kept the attention of lawmakers, and we utilized a statewide process involving more than 1,000 families, educators, school leaders, advocates, policy experts, and what we're now calling, because it's a bit of a mouthful, the My Blueprint. Right. The My Blueprint framework does identify a very clear path toward a smarter, fairer, and more sustainable funding system that is now aligned to research back, aligned to student need. And fun fact, the research basis we used for that was a study that the national group ARR conducted on Ohio at Ohio Department of Ed's request and was issued in fall of 2022. Now, Ohio and our fun competition between states, y'all have yet to implement the updates from the research that was found in that 2022 study. And so we here in Michigan, we still need to implement it too, but we've utilized research that was done on your state and with like professional judgment expertise and input from your state. to build the model for our state. So maybe we need to kick this off as the next great Michigan Ohio challenge, right? So some key, kind of takeaways from just building up to this point is consensus building is a necessary part of advocacy systems change work. Consensus is what makes stronger implementation possible. However, consensus alone does not implement policy. So next slide, please. And this is one of the most overlooked lessons. So many advocacy efforts end after the recommendations, like I said, the report that gets commissioned and issued, and then you get like a press release, and there's a couple of media hits and some articles about it, maybe a few social media posts, and then like what of it? And so we are committed to this not just being a project that was done and a report that was issued and sits on a shelf. We are now the advocacy backbone to translate this research, this legislative project into practice. And so knowing this, as soon as we delivered the blueprint report last fall to the legislature, we immediately started to activate into continuing to build that civic infrastructure to develop the policy implementation pathway and advocacy to make adoption possible. And so the Autism Alliance of Michigan intentionally convened a technical work group that took some of our core policy expertise and school finance experts to keep carrying that analysis forward. We also formed a coalition of partner organizations that we call RISE, which stands for Reimagine Improve Special Education. So again, coalitions upon coalitions, there's crossover of members. And you might be saying like, well, why have multiple coalitions? So RISE represents advocacy organization partners. My PAC is a mix of it all, right? It's individuals, it's organizational partners, it's a whole mix of people. RISE is very specifically focused on our organizational partner network in Michigan. And so we continued to build those partnerships and deepen them. We offered information sessions and we met with policymakers and state level leaders. We hosted our first ever MyPAC Advocacy Day in Lansing. And so all of these different activities, but they're all pointing towards the same focused goal, the same end. It's lots of different tactics to get to the same sort of leverage point, right? And so our primary target to implement the My Blueprint framework is through the state school aid budget process. And truly, this is pretty incredible for work of this magnitude in just 8 months. So from the time we delivered the report in October 2025 to Michigan's finalization of the FY fiscal year 27 budget that just happened in early July this month, we went from delivering that final report to making it into our governor's executive recommendations in February of this year. It was intent language, which is not as big of a win as actually implementation language, but again, for such huge change and really what is the most complex area of education policy, school finance, special education, it doesn't get much harder than that. Very few people truly understand it. So I'm not surprised that it's going to take a little bit more of a runway to get full implementation in place. But it was a huge policy win to get the governor to recognize the need for this and aim towards intent language that did get carried through our state Senate and then made it into the final budget that was released the first week of July. And so here we go. This roller coaster ride, the dips in the valley, you keep going up a hill and then down and then up. Now we're on the next series, right? Like now we're on to the next level of advocacy and what does it take and how do we regroup? So policy adoption is an important milestone. Policy momentum and they're not the finish line though, right? So implementation really isn't even the end itself either. This is all like we're right now as this case study, we're right in the middle of how systems change takes place, right? Like the movement towards the change that's necessary to then have an effect on the system. So next slide, please. So how do we know? So this was another question. Aside from everybody having a mind block of like, where's more money going to come from, which Michigan has not totally solved for yet. But the other kind of block to a lot of people's thinking when we were talking to lawmakers and like business sector leaders and others was, how will we know whether the system is improving? And truly, everyone we've engaged with doesn't question that Michigan is vastly underserving by proof of our outcomes, students with disabilities in our state. But there was never like a single kind of collective source for showing that, right? And so again, as I've been emphasizing, lived experience really tells us, what families are experiencing, what families identify as barriers, what families need changed. And then systems level data tells us how widespread these challenges are and whether they're changing over time. And so we ended up issuing the first ever. I don't know. I couldn't find an example of this in any other state. So I don't know if this is the first state example like nationally, but it's absolutely the first time this has ever been done in Michigan. A special education benchmark report that we released in December of last year, right when we were doing our Lansing Advocacy Day, to try to get buy-in to implement the My Blueprint framework. And so it's the mix that we hear about a lot in policy advocacy of stories and data intertwined. So stories help us understand the human impact, but this benchmark data, the systems level data demonstrates that, again, these aren't isolated experiences. You can't just wash away this one parent's very, traumatic experiences like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I've never heard of anything like that before. Oh, you haven't? Well, then why do we have one of the worst graduation rates in the nation, right? Like this isn't just happening to one person, one family, one student. And so those statewide conditions, trying to show that they require statewide solutions. So that C survey, the Special Education Experience Survey, help us understand the barriers along the way. And then this benchmark report helps us demonstrate that those experiences reflect measurable, like that's a key thing too. Can we measure it over time? These are measurable statewide conditions, not isolated incidents. And we hope too that for our families that are connected to our network, that this is also somewhat validating because there is a lot of gaslighting in the advocacy space when it comes to family advocacy and special education and like, no, what's happening to you is real and it's happening to many, many other people and we need to solve for it, right? So this is our, what we believe is our compelling systems change call. And rather than treating any one of these things, the C survey, the My Blueprint framework, the benchmark report as like separate projects, right? Or reports that get issued and sit on the shelf and, oh, okay, job done. We continually synthesize them and try to kind of triangulate them and build them all together to kind of fundamentally get at what are families and students experiencing, what should we change, and how is the system actually performing in making moves towards impact and change. And so we built that evidence. That evidence wasn't, the system wasn't going to like hand us the evidence we needed to make the big call for change. And it took more than one report. It took more than one approach. It took multiple different lanes. And so when I talk about that infrastructure, this is a lot of what I'm trying to show as examples, right? So, okay, next slide. This is just a visual to kind of re-summarize a lot of what I've been talking about and sharing. And so in my limited graphic design capability. So this is kind of a recap here where, my PAC forming with Autism Alliance as the backbone, we went through in 2021 a strategic framework, strategic planning process as an organization and set, I guess an important note to this is we had set a 10-year vision to basically enact systems transformation that would improve outcomes for students with disabilities to be more on par with non-disabled peers. And one of the most concrete indicators of that are the high school diploma rates, right? Like high school graduation rates. So in our aspirational call, it's in 10 years, Michigan should improve the system and how they're serving students with disabilities so that graduation rates become on par. There's a 25 percentage point gap currently in our state between students with IEPs and non-disabled peers. So we have a big hole to climb out of, but that's the kind of compelling case, right? So then we said, okay, let's do a landscape analysis of a collection of grass tops, grassroots, partner organizations, constituents. And then we're like, okay, everybody's agreeing that resources, they're all saying resources are why we can't have nice things in Michigan. But really, like, because of our coalition, we're hearing so much from families about all these barriers and like, can we analyze those? So that's the special education experience survey. And then from that, those two analyses told us the root cause to go after is funding reform. Like that was so clear across every core constituent. And so that was the advocacy then to get the legislative project. And we knocked the legislative project out of the park and over delivered, honestly, to what the legislature had asked and needed from us. But then the question was, yes, there's the lived experience. Yes, there's our proven policy, research backed path forward. But how will we know? What's the urgency? How do we know how bad it is? And how will we start to know if we make change, will we improve? And that's the benchmark report. And then how do we keep driving this forward? It's continuing the infrastructure of MyPAC, but it's also bringing in other elements like RISE for our partner organization. So we do have another Zoom poll. So after this whole pitch and my kind of case study of all this, nope, well, you can go on that side, but we do have a Zoom poll. Yes. Okay. So, and this can be, if I haven't swayed any answers, that's fine. This can be what you came in thinking, or it could be if your thinking has changed through the course of this presentation. But just, I sort of wanted to gauge, what do you think creates the biggest barrier to systems change? Let's see. Families aren't organized. Okay, so families aren't organized, only 5%. Decision makers don't hear enough of lived experience, 5%. Organizations work in silos, 25%. People think they're, at least it wasn't compelling enough to say there isn't enough shared evidence, but then all of the above, 65%. Okay, I think you're right. Yeah, I would agree with that. But honestly, the results of that surprised me a little bit. I would have expected maybe a little more scattering across. But this is a savvy group that I think you all see maybe the case I'm making for like the intertwining of it all, right? Like the need to thread the through line to connect those dots. And so that kind of leads us to, kind of, if I had to distill it down to 5 kind of lessons from what we've been learning in Michigan, really the importance of organizing before you kind of make those really critical advocacy requests and really drive hard on the advocacy front with policymakers, decision makers. Again, MyPAC, we needed a network in Michigan to serve this role, but it's not just a coalition to like meet, it is infrastructure, and the way I've kind of been describing it. And, turning stories into evidence. The C survey was a research project, it was a report, but it was also part of the infrastructure. Building consensus so that my blueprint framework process, again, was a legislative project and a report, and we could have all patted ourselves on the back and just been like, here it is, we delivered, but we are including it as part of our critical infrastructure for change. And then, the plan for implementation, not just policy adoption, that's that carry forward of like really deepening our connections to our partner organizations through RISE. And who knows what's to come. I mean, this is part of what's exhilarating about systems change work, but also what's really, really hard is I'm operating off of multi-year kind of aspirational vision. And then I'm constantly synthesizing it with real-time landscape. And we know, like, with all the changes in the federal issues, it's just constantly, it's like every day, it's like, what new thing has happened or is going to impact this, or do I have to take into account? And like in Michigan, we're going into this fall of a significant gubernatorial election. And like that has major implications for the work that's been underway and how it will take shape and what's to come. And so it is a challenge to kind of sustain this over time. Like I'm not going to shy away from sharing candidly how difficult it is. And people power truly is what makes it possible. It sounds a little like cliche maybe, but I cannot overemphasize how critical our MyPAC membership, what that has meant to the just the power behind all of our advocacy actions. And so then fundamentally being able to measure success by changes in the system conditions. So going back to the conditions holding problems in place, we want to see changes in those conditions. We want to see measurable improvements across system metrics. And so if I had to leave you with a bottom line in trying to make my compelling case for the why of building, implementation, advocacy, accountability, infrastructure in this space, is because it really does create influence. And that really matters for being able to drive that impact. So next slide. So I just kind of bringing it back to, again, like a fundamental why, I think of every IEP meeting, every parent story, every state complaint, every due process hearing. All of this is necessary. All of this experience matters. And when we connect them together, they become something even bigger than each isolated incident. They become power, people power, and they become evidence. The evidence becomes policy. Policy becomes an implementation pathway, and implementation, with fidelity and done the right way with accountability, will drive systems change, and change systems, will improve the outcomes for students who, may never know the names of the people whose advocacy made this possible. And that's that power, and that's the essence of collective impact advocacy, which is something I've just really over time come to love. It's a lot of building bridges is what a lot of the work entails. So we talked, in today's presentation, even just about community voice, and how to weave that throughout everything, but also amplify it and really turn it into, again, that power to make a compelling case. So my parting thought for you all is to think about, the Zoom poll questions along the way were like kind of reflective of like, where are you now with your activities? What do you think's needed in all of it? And so then my reflective question for you is just ask yourself where you are in this continuum, kind of this bridge, and where you can help strengthen it. So maybe you can help organize families that have repeat issues. Maybe you can collect stories, analyze data, join into coalitions like MyPAC. Maybe you can influence policy change. Whatever your role is, that systems change really is a collective team effort. And people power does become, systems change power when we intentionally build on that infrastructure. And so last slide is just my thank you. And like I like to think of like ripple effect. Like I think of systems change advocacy as like the ripple effect, the concentric circles of you're kind of doing these activities and you're like kind of throwing the stone into the pond, and like you see it start to ripple out, and you don't always see like where all the ripples will go, but like that they can keep building and keep growing. And for me, that imagery, I think about ripple effects a lot in systems change advocacy. And so, what we're trying to work for is a funding system that's more responsive, policies that better reflect actual student needs, more inclusive opportunities, vastly improved outcomes. This is the power of collective advocacy. So hopefully I've convinced you all to become systems change advocates.
Yes, Heather, definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We're definitely over time, but
sorry.
Your presentation was amazing. And thank you so much for posting your information up there. Yeah. And we know your slides are in the handouts online. And thank you again for your presentation, Heather. We will be going on a break now and returning in a couple minutes at 11:10 a.m. So I will see you guys soon. And thank you again, Heather.
Thanks. Sorry, Renee. I was looking at the time, and then I couldn't do the math of like when. Sorry.
Nope, you're fine. No problem. I was sending you chats, but I didn't know if you saw them.
I didn't see them. No, sorry. Thank you.
No problem.
Sorry for the 3 minutes over.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, just fill out the evaluation for the session as well. Thanks, Heather.